preparation for our fall season. It was really nice last week if you were here with Liz Green kicking things off with a study of her farm and the work that she does there with Three Sisters Project. We'll actually be seeing a little bit of that theme. I think we'll see some connections maybe today with some of the early sharing passages in Acts. So there might be some overlap if you're here last week, some concepts that we were looking at. But it's a pleasure to be back. It already feels like fall is off and running. This morning certainly felt like it, although, what was it, Friday? It was like 78 degrees or something. That is not helping me adjust towards what's coming. But, we'll take the sunshine when we get it. Let me pray for us, and then I've got a little announcement, and then I'll kind of set up what we're going to do for the next couple weeks. But let me pray for us. Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you for today, just the chance to gather. We thank you for the sunshine and the changing of seasons. We're reminded just how change is a process of life. And we pray that in significant ways, God, we would see how you are changing us from one season to another. And in this new season, God, we would pray for your discernment and wisdom to see where you are growing us and where you are challenging us. We pray that we would be ever committed to seeing your kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. Praise your name. Amen. All right, Father Patrick wanted me to announce that there are a couple of signs over here that if you want them for your front yard, this is for the silent auction for Haiti. There's two here. There are a few more. He said they're free, although I will take $10 each for them. No. No, they are free. So if you want one for your front lawn, those are here. And I guess there's a few more over in the main building. Across the way there. So please feel free to take some of those. That'll be October 24th, which is coming up about a month. And so we'll be having that. All right, so I want to kind of set up. So I will be kind of teaching for the next 4 weeks on the book of Acts. We're not going to do the whole book. In some ways, as Patrick and I were discussing this about 6 months ago, end of spring, we have a Greece trip coming up for us here at Christ Church. Sorry, I just combined First Church with, doing a trip with First Baptist from Greensboro to Turkey in March. And so I combined First Baptist and Christ Church to First Church. Christ Church, I'll make sure we get on the right plan, don't worry. We'll be going to Greece in May, and we have a deadline for sign up at the end of October. And so we thought if you weren't convinced already that maybe 4 weeks in the book of Acts might do it. Right, and so this is going to kind of set up what we're going to be doing in Greece in May. I will be back at the end of spring to do a couple weeks specifically related to the trip. So we're going to be looking at Acts 16 through 18 in the spring because that's where our Greece trip will be going. We're going to be following along, going down through Thessalonica, Philippi, Athens, Corinth, Cenchrea, and back up to Athens, which is that part of Paul's second missionary journey in the book of Acts. And so in light of where we're going literally in May, we thought it'd be helpful to start a series on Acts here in the fall. And instead of teaching from now till May, which was an option, spending like 16 weeks on the book of Acts, we thought we'd do 4 weeks here to kind of kick it off, and then we'll return to it in the spring. And so what I want to do for the next 4 weeks is look at those kind of early chapters of Acts. I kind of want to look at why we have the book of Acts, what it's doing in our New Testament, and really what gets us going to Greece. I mean, if we think about it, we are kind of indebted to this person named Theophilus and the early Christians for even wanting to go there in 2025. I mean, part of the reason why we're connected to that place is because of these scriptural texts and the role and growth and the spread of the early Jesus movement outside of Jerusalem, which we're going to see how we get there over these next couple weeks, and how it emerges in the Roman world to modern-day Turkey, which is Asia Minor in the ancient world, Greece, and then of course, Italy. So what's really nice about this, right, is we are partaking in a faith that's a historic faith that's rooted in real times and real places with real people. And so we can go to those places today and kind of imagine and really be transported back to those earliest days of the Jesus movement and see what the challenges were for those communities, what the opportunities were, and really how they began to transform the Roman world really kind of one day at a time. In hopes, I think it's always our hope, that we would see that same connection to our community, the link there being the Spirit that is invested in our community was also there in their community, and see how in our day the challenges that await us, the opportunities, and hopefully day by day, right, a transformation that's taking place not only in our lives and our community, but hopefully in our world. That's one of the nice things about studying ancient history, is you do get a little bit of perspective, you do get hindsight, and you do get to see how things work out. And I hope in some ways this is a testament to the faithfulness of God to work out his kingdom purposes in diverse settings and contexts. So what we're going to do today is kind of talk about what Acts is, just as a type of scripture, and see maybe some of Luke's purposes for why he wrote. Some of this is going to kind of rely on some knowledge that you probably have had from the book of Acts previously, and we'll hopefully interject some new things. So to begin, in very simplest terms, the book of Acts functions as a bridge text, and it's more than that, but it's certainly at minimum a bridge between the Gospels and the letters of Paul. So in many ways it's an explanatory book. It's how we get from A to B to C and so on, right? In fact, if you think about it, if you didn't have the book of Acts in our canon, right, we'd have a lot of confusion when we end the gospel stories. If we end with John, assuming it's the same Bible we have now without Acts, right? The last thing you would have experienced was having breakfast on the beach with Jesus, right? Having your fish burritos, sitting there in Galilee with 11 Jewish disciples, right? We got 11, we lost Judas, and Jesus. And then you'd flip your page, right? After you finish the Gospel of John, you're like, wow, that was a great ending, love it, where are we going next? And the next thing you would read would be, if we had the same Bible, Paul, an apostle to the church in Rome. And you would be like, okay. Number one, who's this Paul guy? We didn't see him in the Gospels, right? And then you're flipping back through like, did I miss something? Did I fall asleep? Number two, how did we get to Rome, the capital of the Roman Empire? And there's a church there. Okay, how do we get from A to B to C, right? And so in many ways, Acts at its most simplest form is doing that. It's explaining how we get from 12 Jewish disciples on a beach in Galilee, right, all the way to the capital of the Roman Empire. How do we get new figures in our story? And so really, in many ways, we're indebted to the book of Acts because it's filling in that material to show how we move. And what we see in the book of Acts is a lot of movement. In more than just geographic ways, it's probably what we're most familiar with. The story moves from Jerusalem to Judea to Samaria to the uttermost parts of the world, right? But it also moves in other significant ways. We have movement not just geographically, we have movement sociologically, right? So we're moving from, in some ways, a more rural kind of context from ancient Galilee to urban settings. So we're going to be in cities in the book of Acts. Thessalonica, Philippi, Antioch, Rome. These are some of the major cities of the Roman Empire. And just to give us a glimpse of coming attractions, right? This is like going to the major cities of today. You're in New York, Paris, LA, Boston, right? They're going to the major urban centers. And so we're seeing this movement, right, from, I don't want to say like a peasant world, but to a very urban world there. We're moving sociologically kind of up the chain, right? So in the Gospels, we meet local kings, we meet local leaders, like leader of the Sanhedrin, but in Acts, we're going to be in front of emperors and in front of large Roman officials, right? So we see this kind of sociological movement in the story, bringing in a vast amount of new people. Of course, we also have a movement, a third movement. I think you can at least trace at least 3 movements in the book of Acts. And this one probably is a little bit more obvious. We move from a very Jewish-dominated gospel stories, right? Almost everyone is Jewish in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You need about 5 non-Jewish people in the story, roughly counting there. To what's going to be a multi-ethnic movement in the book of Acts, to a very Gentile movement. And so we're going to have this movement of this, how does this kind of very Jewish revolutionary movement get spread around the ancient Mediterranean, go through lots of major Roman cities, and become in some ways, it's kind of the trajectory, a very Gentile-dominated faith, right? So the book of Acts is explaining all kind of 3 of those movements through this story. And it relates really in many ways to what the nature of this book is. We think Acts is a form of ancient history writing. There's lots of historians in the Roman world tracing the rise of Rome. People like Polybius and Suetonius, where they're basically saying, okay, how did the Roman Empire come to be? Where did we start, and how did we arrive at where we are? And in many ways, Luke is tapping into that tradition as he writes this story. He's not kind of just doing a stream of consciousness and here's another story, right? We actively think that he is modeling his text off these kind of Greek histories. We're going to see that in a couple of significant ways today. So we have Luke the historian. I may have mentioned this a couple sessions ago when I was here last time, but Luke has some precedent. Think through our Bibles. Does the book of Acts resemble any other text that you find between Genesis and Revelation? Where we have figures, people having speeches.
Like the Chronicles of Kings,
Yes, yeah. Yeah, so 1st and 2nd Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Samuel, the historical books of the Old Testament, right? So there is a kind of little corrective here that we often say that, history writing started with Herodotus, the Greek, right? It's actually kind of a misnomer. There's a very interesting reason why that starts there, why people want histories to start with the Greeks. Israelites were doing this for a much longer time before that. And so although we think Luke is writing as like a Greek historian, he's got models, right, in his rear view mirror. Because if you think about the book of 1st and 2nd Kings, it's tracing primary figures. There's stories related to them. There's speeches. And so Luke he doesn't have to just be in a Greek kind of frame. He has a lot of historical precedent with tracing, the work of God through a people, right? So he has that right at bay. And so there might be a little kind of a convergence here that Luke is kind of bringing together these two models, because he's certainly not just writing like plain history, right? He's doing theological history of how God interacts with humans, right, in time and space. And so as we look at this, right, these historian concerns are going to come throughout the text. We'll see this in just a minute. So we'll move on from who Luke is. We think he might be a co-traveler with Paul. So he joins the story in Acts 16. We get these famous we passages. So throughout Acts, it's all third person. Stephen did this, Peter did that. And then in Acts 16, it says, we went to Troas. And it looks like the author joins the story right in the middle of it. This tends to be a hallmark of kind of Greek history writing. The Greeks really loved their historians to get involved in the process. They loved them to kind of get their hands dirty, to go to a battle, go to a scene, be part of it. Whereas the Romans tended to be more librarian researchers. They like to not get their hands dirty, like to go hit the books. So they would rely on more written sources. So the fact that Luke joins it would be kind of a hallmark. People would think, okay, he's a real historian. He's actually at the event that he's recording, right? And so we're going to see that there. And so if this is the same Luke, his name's Lucius, if it's Latin, this is a co-traveler with Paul at some points. We don't have time to do this today, but there's some interesting overlaps between Paul's letters and some of the stories in Luke's gospel. One quick example, if you know anything about Paul, he talks about justification, right? Justification by faith, not by works. The only references that we get to justification in all of the Gospels are in Luke's Gospel. Matthew, Mark, and John don't use that language to talk about Jesus. So it seems that there's some bleeding right over into Luke's story. And so Luke is this historian. We tend to think of him as a physician, which makes some sense that he's a doctor of some sorts. He comes from Philippi. That's where we meet him kind of in the story. In Acts 16, fun fact, Philippi was a leading medical educational training center in the ancient world, so that kind of bears out. Although, as I think I mentioned a couple sessions ago, doctors were not very famous in the ancient world, largely because medicine is kind of trial and error at this point, right? You don't have any x-rays, you don't have any painkillers, right? At least powerful ones. So you probably don't want someone cutting you open and saying, hey, let me tinker around in there and find out like where your spleen is, right? So most doctors were enslaved. So it's a burgeoning field in the first century, which is probably not what you want for your doctor, the Wild West of, thanks for being our guinea pig, right? We're grateful, but, probably not signing up like, I have a tummy ache, please come work on me. Right? So anyways, Luke, but what this means is that Luke is educated. And that's what we're going to see reflected in this text, is that Luke can read, he can write, he can do research, which puts him in the top 10% of the ancient world. Like, this is an elite project here, right? Not a lot of people can do this. And we'll talk about who he writes to in just a minute. So Luke writes to someone named Theophilus. This is one of the only books in the New Testament where we get a dedication, right? So it names the actual recipient of the text. His name literally means lover or lovers of God. Theophilus, right? So theos being the term for God. Phileo being the Greek verb to love, right? So it means lover of God, which is a kind of really cool name in some ways. We get our name Theodore, right, from that in English. Anyways, we think that this isn't actually a high-profile Roman. So everywhere else where Luke uses the term "O noble" or "O most excellent," depending on your translations, it refers to a real person. And so we think that Luke is writing for his patron. So Theophilus, we don't know a lot about him. He obviously doesn't appear in the gospel text, so he seems to be a second-generation Jesus follower. But at some point, he puts his resources, considerable ones, by the way, towards creating Luke Acts as this kind of singular work. We might talk a little bit later about how Luke Acts is meant to be read together. And so he kind of writes the check, right? He puts down the money. For number one, for Luke to go interview eyewitnesses. We know in Luke 1:1-4 that Luke says, I interviewed eyewitnesses, I'm creating an orderly account. And so we want to think about Luke traveling, right? So he goes to probably Jerusalem, he goes to Galilee, he goes to Thessalonica, and thinking very practically, right? Who's paying for him to get there, right? To get on a ship isn't free. To find a hostel to stay in or an inn is not free. Your food isn't free. And so it seems that Theophilus kind of puts down the seed money and says, I want you to go do this project for me. Come back when you're done. Here's some funds. He also probably pays very literally for the document. Like, we need to think really practically. The paper to be made, the scribe to write it down, the ink. This is very costly in the ancient world. So Theophilus has this kind of great gift, right, that he has, that he alone has. I mean, think of when this book drops, right? We only have Mark, Matthew, maybe John. That's a debate, right? A couple letters of Paul are out by this point. So the canon of the New Testament is quite small. And then we're going to get Luke Acts as this massive project. We get the longest gospel in Luke. It's the longest text, and we get a sequel, right? And so at some point, Theophilus and I would think his friends have this for their kind of literary club in the ancient world. This is entertainment. You would sit around and you would read text aloud, right? No audiobooks, but this is, the first version of an audiobook. And you would read this aloud in amongst your friend groups on a Friday night, right? It was wild times, right? Like, got a new book. I'm going to sit around, maybe have some tea or a pint, I guess, in the ancient world, right? And listen to the story unfold because you want more Jesus stories, right? And this probably explains for Theophilus, and we want to think about his logic. If he's come to this movement later on, this is explaining for Theophilus, a Gentile, how he got incorporated into the story. How is it that this story has come to Theophilus? It's probably what he wants to figure out is, okay, where did this begin? How did we get here, right? And so in many ways, this is kind of an existential project for Theophilus, a spiritual existentialism in some way. I'm saying, here's your story. And in many significant ways, this is our story, right? Theophilus is a Gentile. I'm going to assume for the room a little bit that we're all Gentiles. And so in many ways, we are kind of in that line of the spiritual heritage of Theophilus. And in many ways, we're going to see Theophilus reappear throughout the book. And you're like, wait a second, I don't think I saw him. Remember, he's a very elite, wealthy Roman person. And we're going to get a lot of stories about wealth and economic sharing and poverty. And so you want to take Theophilus as kind of your ideal reader. He's the one who this book is written for. And so he kind of runs underneath all the scenes. And you want to think about how he would be hearing these stories, him and his friends. We're going to see a story this morning, hopefully, time-wise, people selling homes to help fund some of the economic sharing in the early church. A lot of people don't own homes in the ancient world, but Theophilus and his friends do. So this is going to hit them differently than it would hit everyone else in that story. We're going to hear stories about radical generosity throughout Luke and throughout Acts. It's Theophilus and his friends who are going to have to think about that. And in some ways, this is actually kind of fascinating. When you remember Theophilus through the story, some of the sayings of Jesus get pretty pointed when you take this as your ideal reader, right? When Jesus says that his ministry is going to be good news for the poor. When Mary prophesies over Jesus that the rich are going to be set away empty and the hungry are going to be filled. When we get the woes to the rich, I mean, this is going to step on some toes a little bit here, right? But in some ways, I would argue that I think Theophilus represents for Luke something that we're going to see throughout the story, which is transformed wealth. That this is how people of higher status enter into this story. They use their gifts for the sake of the community. Whether that's a home, whether that's clothing, whether that's food, or whether that's a text, right? And so in very interesting ways, I think Theophilus represents the transformed wealthy person. So there are these like kind of big critiques of wealthy people in the stories. You know, the rich young ruler goes away grieving because he had many possessions. That's one alternative, right? You also have Zacchaeus, who meets and says, I'm going to give away half my resources. And I think Theophilus stands kind of in that line of a transformed wealthy person because he acts in generous ways. In fact, in a very significant way, right, we actually stand 2,000 years removed from Theophilus' generosity. We stand downstream from that. If Theophilus had not chosen to be generous, we might be reading something else. But here we are, and there's this really profound thing that we never know what God's going to do with our generosity, right? That there could be a community that you will never meet, right? That becomes a recipient, a beneficiary of that kind of radical generosity. And I think we see that by these stories that we're reading. We stand and say, okay, our faith is strengthened by what someone else gave. So as we think about Theophilus, we're going to keep him in mind as we go through the story. So one of the things that we're going to meet through the story, and this comes back to what we see, is if you think about the book, there's actually a lot of people talking in it. And sometimes we call these sermons, like the sermons in Acts, because we're thinking of a church setting. They're not particularly sermons. They do take scriptural texts, and they are like explaining them, right? So Peter's going to do this at Pentecost. We're going to see that. But one of the hallmarks of ancient history writing was speeches. So they prized first-person kind of speech writing. We want to hear it from the general's mouth. We want to hear it from the emperor himself. And so as you think about the book of Acts, think about all the people that you see talking in the book. And in many ways, the book really is speeches that are woven together with a narrative. And so what you find in the book of Acts is kind of narrative speech. And so Luke has kind of tied these threads together to work us through a story. But primarily the backbone, if you will, are these speeches. 1/3 of the book is speeches. And again, this is where ancients would really like this. They want to hear something written in the voice of that person. Now we can get into the debate of, what did they say? There's a fun debate there. I want you to see how these are allotted in the book. So hopefully you can see this. These are all the speeches in the book of Acts. Now, if you just had the speeches, what observations could you make about the story? Give a couple minutes to think about this.
Well, this is sort of a ridiculous observation, but it looks like Peter and Paul make more speeches
Yep.
than anybody.
No, that's a great observation. Yeah. Look, we got some main characters here. Yeah.
Something about Stephen being kind of smack dab, not the center.
Yep.
But like with Peter and Paul, or Peter's first thought.
Yeah. I mean, it's at the center of the book.
No,
Yeah.
but like the longest speech.
Yeah, if we're thinking about author, right, we've talked about this before, but they all have to make decisions, right? What to choose, how long to tell a story. These are all selection, editing. So we can at least learn something from Luke, assuming he has some purpose and intent. Why does he give the longest speech to Stephen? Does that mean importance? Does that mean like a paradigmatic? We at least have the observation. Now we'll have to get into the story and figure that out, but just from the allotment of narrative material, you get some significance, right? Either that or Luke just, forgot to stop typing or something, right? We hope there's a little bit more going on here. They go, that seems intentional.
So the first half is the disciples and the second half is Paul.
Mm-hmm.
You said that Luke comes in the second half.
Yep.
So is there a difference in how we interpret the first half versus the second half in the sense that Luke, I assume, has sort of is on this scene for the second half, where the first half it's based on interviews or other, like, is there some sort of difference in the writing between the two?
Yeah, there's a couple things when Luke comes into the story, we're going to see a couple things shift in it. Obviously, Luke is farther away from the gospel itself, right? Luke 1 through 24, right? And then the early parts of Acts, he's not there. So he is relying on sources, eyewitnesses, other written documents. He narrates this in Luke 1 through 4, that there are other gospel stories out there. I looked at all of them and decided to write an orderly account, right? I interviewed eyewitnesses. The term diegesis means narrative. So he's like, I'm going to tell a story here. As we get later on in the story, something's going to drop out that we're going to see in a minute. He has these what are called summary statements, and those drop. So there's a famous one in Acts 2 we're going to look at it this morning, right? That they shared all things in common, right? They devoted themselves to the breaking of bread, the apostles' teaching and prayer. Acts scholars, we call those summary statements. They're little encapsulations of time. And what we're arguing is that is actually in some ways tying over or biding over the periods that Luke knows least about. And so as we get closer to his time, those summary statements drop out because he essentially has more material. And so if you think about the story of the Ethiopian eunuch, there's a kind of a sharp break there, right? And then we get to Paul. And so it's as if he's using his sources and he's, I don't want to say pasting them together, but the narrative tissue are those summary statements. It's linking time for when he might not have a source. I'll show you an example of that. But the important part is that those completely drop out after chapter 14. So he's closer to his time period. He probably has more material. He's there for the second half of the book. And so we just get a little bit more detailed elements. So that's a good observation. Anyone else?
Jason, does Stephen provide a threshold for the reader as you go through his speech? It just seems as though there are a lot of elements that are being woven in, not only just a history, but it's a threshold to step into something else.
Yeah, so Stephen's death is kind of the catapult that launches them out of Jerusalem. So they're going to move to Antioch, which is in modern day Syria, right? And so they're going to be pushed out. And so that becomes the threshold. And you probably have this mentality of before and after his death, like the temperature's being turned up and they're being driven out. And so that may be why it's the longest, because maybe it marks a particular moment in the community where things dramatically changed. Right? We've already had death in the story. Jesus has died, so it's not like they haven't encountered that before. But this is one of the first apostles to die, right? So that could be the threshold. It's certainly geographically a threshold, because this is what kind of gets them to the uttermost parts of the earth, right? And then the longest speech, right? It's a, as you mentioned, it's a walk through the Old Testament. It's kind of like if you thought the Old Testament was too long, here's like the Reader's Digest version, right? Like hitting the high points, right? Just give me the short version, right? Joanna, I can. Joanna's like, come on. There's about so much good material. But what you see is through these speeches, right? They're narrating a particular version of Israel's history that leads up into the Messiah. And I think you get that from Jesus in Luke 24, right? Remember the road to Emmaus? He said he opened up the scriptures. and walk them and show them how they all lead to him, I think you actually get what Jesus did in these speeches in Acts. That's where they're getting that material. I think it is much their insight. I think it's Jesus also saying, hey, here's how you read that story so that it comes in and through me, and my death is not the end point, it's the beginning. Yeah.
Just a question related to that about Theophilus as the ideal reader. So there's lots of like scripture, I mean there's the summary that Stephen gives, but there's also particular scriptures quoted a lot of times.
Yeah.
Like what would Theophilus and his friend, what are we supposed to imagine that they know about those scriptures? Are they like, oh yeah, we've heard that one because we've been studying it, or are they like, what is that? I gotta ask somebody. Well, how do those function, I guess?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think at minimum, it is getting them access to a story that they might not have all the parts to. So I think the length of Stephen's speech is doing something educationally for the community, right? Because remember, we're not walking around with Bibles on our phones or like literally scrolls, right? Now, Theophilus may have access to a library, I would assume. Given his status, we do know of libraries all throughout Rome. Maybe he has access to a synagogue, but they're not going to have primary access to the text, right? And so this is a way that it's going to function for many in the ancient world, oral stories, right? That's what they're going to remember, those high points. And so I think in many ways this may be giving them some of those stories for the first time, because they're probably not carrying Genesis around with them, or the prophet Joel, or the prophet Amos, right? And so some of this may be new. I think at another level what it's doing is it's rooting the Jesus movement in a previous story. So there is this thing in the Roman world that if you are a new religion, no one's going to join you. Like they actually value what's old and what has tradition. And so what the gospel writers are doing, and Acts, is rooting this new movement in a very ancient story, so that they become the next chapter in that unfolding story that goes all the way back to Genesis, right? And that being said, there's another point, like this is a Jewish story, right? Especially in the first parts of Acts. We don't have Gentiles yet. And so they're saying we're this new kind of like unfolding chapter in the story that God's been telling for a very long time. So I think what this is doing is giving these little historical anchors for the movement to say we have pedigree, essentially.
Yeah, just a quick question. So that place in Luke, where Jesus is walking along the road and he reveals to them all the things about the scriptures,
Yep.
and then eventually shows how it all points toward him. Would you say that that's a literal transcription of what happened? Or those were taken from eyewitness accounts. People told the story about Jesus revealing everything about himself in the Psalms, the prophets, etc. But what you're describing here is a more architectural or a planned, designed outcome.
Yeah.
Seems to me than people having this sense that God is speaking directly to them, telling this story that they're part of includes them, but also point toward him.
Yeah, I would argue, fancy term, I think he gives them a hermeneutical strategy for reading the text, which we find all throughout the Second Temple period. Like people are interpreting these texts in a variety of ways. And so Jesus says, here's a way of reading the story where the death of the Messiah is actually, in some things, you're going to go, oh yeah, I see that now. And so I think this is why we see texts like Isaiah take precedence, particularly Isaiah 53. That becomes in some ways an explanatory sense of a suffering servant. There's lots of other ways to read that passage before Jesus steps on the scene, whether it's Israel itself that's suffering, whether it's a particular figure of Israel that's suffering. Obviously the early Christians are going to say, this looks like Jesus, right? But I think that all goes back to Jesus' own ways of reading the text. And again, in Luke 24, we don't get the footnotes. I wish we had that, right? But I think we do a little bit in Acts, because I think that's all the place that they go. All still allowing for Peter, James, John, Paul to read text in a new way. So I think we're going to come on both of those. Jesus, I think, kicks it off, and then they might kind of continue that. But I think some of the stories probably go back to Jesus. We know that Jesus has some very unique interpretations of the Old Testament, like the Son of Man sayings out of Daniel, seem to be Jesus' innovation. That this is, I'm going to explain who I am through this Danielic text. So we know Jesus has his own innovative ways of reading passages that might originate with him, in the ways that he's approaching that. So yeah, we'll see that as we track through, but I think that's a way, I think Jesus gives them a framework, and then they're kind of living into that framework. Obviously, someone like Paul, right, isn't there at Luke 24, so his interpretation of the Old Testament, it might have come from the community. Maybe they have like a crash course on like reading the Hebrew Bible, as a Jesus follower, where they're like, hey, here's some highlights. Here's the way we're reading these texts. We don't know. Well, all we can see is that the evidence of what they're doing. And kind of reverse engineer that a little bit. But I think what I want to stress is that I think we want to connect what they're doing with what Jesus does in Luke 24. That we're not in the dark on that. We get at least some semblance through these speeches. Great. Yeah.
So I look at this, I keep going back to the point you made about the dedication.
Mhm.
We know really very little about the purposes of the other three gospel writers.
Mhm.
But he says quite a bit about his purpose.
Yeah.
The Theophilus may have certainty concerning the things he has been taught,
Mhm.
which would seem to open well, first of all, it tells us something about how we today can read this, the two parts, and he basically reaffirms that in a shortened dedication to Acts. And so one thing to take from the speeches is the significance of them as intellectual expressions of ideas that that relate to the narrative of the gospel. But can we also deduce that the conviction of Theophilus was important to Luke the writer, in as much as this was a faith that would undergo challenges?
Yeah. So I think that those first 4 verses, the fact that we even have a preface, right, and it reads that way, even if you knew nothing about Greek historiography, you go, oh, that's a very interesting beginning, right? Those are using all those buzzwords of ancient history writing. So it does set it off from the other Gospels. John might get the closest at the end, John 21. These things are written so that you might believe, right? But this is the closest we get. I think that certainty piece is helping kind of root the movement in several different ways. What we're going to see later on in Acts is we get all these trials, right? So Paul is on trial for the second half of the book of Acts. He's appearing before judges and magistrates and political figures. In some ways, as we study this from kind of the first century, this may, in a lawyer sense, be setting precedent for the early Christian community. So they can point to Roman officials that have heard their cases and said, hey, it was dismissed, or not a threat. And so in some ways for Theophilus, it is helping them undergo challenges in the future. And this is kind of providing some documentary evidence. Right, hey, our lead apostles, Peter and Paul, especially Paul, appeared before a Roman official. The entire case was heard. The opponents made their case. Paul made his case. The judge said, I don't care about this. I'm dismissing it. You want to think about other Jesus followers in other communities through the Roman Empire, maybe undergoing the same thing. They're being called forth in front of magistrates. Right? Jesus even talks about this, right? Like, you'll be hauled in front of. And so in some ways, this is underpinning for Theophilus that this movement has feet. It can stand. There might be inter-Jewish debate going on between Jewish followers of Jesus and non-Jesus followers. Are they just making all this stuff up? And so it's providing evidence to say that this is a philosophical movement. Like it has a logic to it that can be rested upon, both judicially, like in terms of cases, both scripturally in terms of like hermeneutics, and then certainly for the suffering piece. Like we're going to see a lot of people suffer through the story. So I think that's what it's doing for Theophilus. It's saying, here's the story you're entering, and here's how the story kind of undergirds your current experience. I think that's how we read the book of Acts today as well, right? We're reading it in a sense of saying, we might find ourselves in particular places and challenges, and this story is meant, not like in a cheesy sense, but as a source of encouragement, a source of purpose, that you're standing in this long line of faithful witness to Jesus as the Messiah. So yeah, I think that that's one thing that it's doing for Theophilus, as well as just filling him in on the major characters. Like these are the cloud of witnesses, to use the language of Hebrews, right? These are the people that brought the movement to you. So I think that's one of the reasons why he's including all this, because we don't know if Theophilus, like, did Theophilus know who Peter was? Like, Theophilus was not in Judea or Galilee, and so he might be hearing about Peter for the first time, right? Obviously, hearing about him in the gospel, but in his role in the kind of the missionary movements. And that's what we find interesting, right? Peter drops out after the first half of the book. You actually don't hear from Peter again after Acts 15. He's not in the narrative at all. And so it shifts to the Paul story. So you see that kind of weaving. So it was a great observation at the beginning, right? You could actually kind of structure the book. We call it the Acts of the Apostles. It's really the Acts of two apostles, Peter and Paul, right? You get some others scattered in there. But they're kind of, in terms of the Oscars, they're the supporting cast, right? Like they're not, I don't want to say the background. They're more than that. But they're not going for like best actor, right? They're not in that category. So this is one of the things we can learn how structure helps us inform purpose and intent, at least as best as we can tell. And so we're going to see this story kind of move. And again, you see this movement as well from like a Jewish-oriented, like Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, to where Paul goes, right? And so you see that shift kind of halfway through the book around Acts 15. One comment on that. James perhaps gets two of the most important speeches in the book. Acts 15 is like the dead center of the book of Acts. It's on the pivot point on which the whole story turns, i.e. how the Gentile is going to come into the community, and then that really sets up the second half of the book, right? So Luke has kind of weaved them together. You have Paul doing Gentile missionary work in Acts 13 and 14, but there's a big question mark around it. Is what he's doing valid? Is it approved? Acts 15 gives them that approval, and then the second half of the book takes off. And so it's a really neat way how Luke has kind of narrated this story all along. And then it becomes a story of Paul on trial with Gentile interaction in the story. So we're going to work through kind of the first half of this book. We're not going to get to the Paul part right now. That's going to come in the spring before we go to Greece. But we're going to do a little bit of what Luke starts off here. So Luke begins Acts 1, this history, he roots it back in Jerusalem. There's this little dovetailing that happens in Luke Acts. You get repetition. You get the final scene, you get an ascension again. It's kind of like, again, you view these as two books. It's like when you're watching a TV show and they're like, previously on, right? And they give you a little bit of like caption to make sure you haven't missed the big plot points. So he re-narrates the ascension again. So he kind of like takes a step back and then we're off and running, right? It's this really beautiful, dovetailing that makes the story very seamless, right? So there's these overlapping pieces. And the question from the disciples, right, there in Acts 1:6 is, Lord, are you at this time going to restore the kingdom to Israel? Right, so this is what we've been waiting for. This, and this does seem to be a theme of Luke Acts, the restoration of the kingdom. Jesus announces the kingdom, says it's coming, it's in your midst. So the disciples ask when and where. And Jesus says, actually, it's not for you to know the times or dates. Kind of question error. But you'll receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you. And so he says, wait in Jerusalem. So it's this interesting question of timing. Like, is it go time? And Jesus says it's actually waiting time. It's not happening now, but you're going to receive power. This becomes a key theme for Luke, the power to witness through the book, empowered by the Holy Spirit, announcing the Spirit indwelling. All right, I want us to take a look. If you have your devices or a Bible, if not, this is going to be fun. Maybe a friend does, and you can cozy up. Look at Acts 2. So this is the famous Pentecost story. I want us to notice something about the nations that are listed there. I'm going to put nations in quotes. See how many you find. And this might not be easy to read, but I will put up here just in case you don't have the text. And I'll make it much larger.
Sorry, how many, what?
How many people groups or, let's say, nations? Try to make that as big as I can. counter? Anyone in accounting? 16, yeah, 15, 16, depending on if you're counting some of the people groups as nations. I'm going to put nations in quotes for a minute because they are represented there, and this is where I get a little, if New Testament professors can have a little hobby horse, reasons I'm really fun at parties, right, is that, we talk about Pentecost being the birth of the church, which, cool, great. This is fascinating because actually in Acts 2 there are no Gentiles. These are all, in verse 5, devout Jews from every nation under heaven. Key term here, living or residing in Jerusalem. There's a debate on what's their length of stay. Anyways, this is a very Jewish Pentecost. The Gentile inclusion doesn't really happen until Acts 10, when we get Cornelius coming in. To put it very pedantically, all the males in this scene are circumcised. Right? They're all following Torah. They're all following Sabbath, keeping kosher laws, right? These are all devout Jews. But what I want us to see through this story is as the story moves, it moves in steps. So we're going to get to non-Jewish people entering the story, but we're going to take kind of 2 to 3 major steps. And I would say this moves in terms of others. So if you have Jews in Jerusalem, that's one group, right? Our first step out is what we call diaspora Jews, Jews living outside the land, which is a difference. There's a linguistic difference, there's a cultural difference, there's an upbringing difference, right? I don't want to press that too far, but just say there's one degree of difference here. I think that's one step out. The next step you're going to see is Acts 10. You're going to meet Cornelius, a Gentile. He's uncircumcised, but he's a God-fearer. And that means that he probably has moved as close as he can to Judaism without that kind of official surgery, right? That's another step. And then the final step you're going to see is Acts 13 and 14, where Paul goes to the region of Galatia, Pergamum, Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, Derbe, and gets non-circumcised, non-God-fearing Gentiles, right? And so if you take a step back, I think there's these short little steps of movement, which I think is an important way to think about change, right? It doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen all at once. And I think there's a grace in this, that it's a slow movement over time, right? Degrees of difference, degrees of others that people are welcoming in before we get to the big kind of, Gentile inclusion, right? Bruce?
Do you think that Paul changed his view over this matter, or who gets included and how they get included? Or did it just come to him all at once that he didn't need to be circumcised, he didn't need to become a Jew?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, how it came to Paul, I think we see this from Acts 2, I think it works for Peter, the Spirit. So when the Spirit falls on Cornelius, this seems to be the kind of watershed moment that God's presence has resided in an uncircumcised Gentile. I use the presence language on purpose, right? The Holy Spirit is God's presence. God's presence, think about the temple, right? Can't be around anything that's unclean. And so what we'll see in Acts 10 and later on with the Gentiles, that they have God's presence residing in them. It seems to be the de facto approval from God that this person is accepted. So I would argue it's a kind of a pneumatological, spirit-led, and that I think is testified through signs and wonders in the book of Acts, that they have God's presence, therefore they've been included into the kingdom without that typical circumcision route. But this is what Acts 15 is going to debate. This is what Galatians is going to debate. It's going to take a while for that. It's not going to be, Peter's going to have an experience in Acts 10, and then he's going to have Acts 10, Acts 11, and Acts 15. He's going to be called to account for it, saying like, what happened? What did you do? And this seems to be kind of the bombshell on the playground, right? That like, this is the moment that changed everything, and they're kind of reacting to saying, if this is how God is moving, what does it mean for the people group, right? All to say, when we're back at Acts 2, that's not clear yet, right? Because it's all circumcised males and Jewish females who are already following the law, already practicing kosher, that receive the Spirit. That makes a little bit more sense. Put that in like, they're already included, right, in the covenant. So this is where it gets, the apostles are kind of theologizing on the ground. What do we do with people who aren't circumcised, who aren't following the law, yet have the Spirit? They're like, all right, 2 plus 2 is not equaling 4 here, right? But they're saying they have the Spirit, so let's kind of back up a little bit and say, what must that mean for God's acceptance? And that's kind of their theological rationale. So that's what I think it's that experience that, and then they go back to text. This is what you see in Galatians. Paul's going to give a theological argument. So it's like experience plus theological argument that explains the rationale. It's not one or the other. They work in tandem together. Yeah.
Can you just explain Acts 2:10, where the phrase both Jews and proselytes seems to suggest that they weren't all Jews?
Well, there's debate, as always. That's the favorite phrase of New Testament professors. So proselytes, I think, would mean that these are Gentile males, previous, who have been circumcised and have officially converted. And again, we're going to look at our time frame. This is where it's going to get really interesting. That is the way, right? Like if you want to join the people of God, Yahweh's movement, right? And you're a male, you can. You've got to get circumcised.
So they were all devout Jews.
Yep.
Some were, verse 10, ethnically Jewish, and some were born Gentiles and had become Jewish.
Yep.
They were that's how to read
Yep.
that. Okay.
Yeah, so this is going to become interesting going forward because we're going to drop this category.
Right.
And that's where Cornelius gets fascinating because he doesn't do the proselyte route. Paul's adamant that Acts 13:14, this group of males are not going to do the proselyte route. And that's where the first friction is going to come up. It's like, well, no, we have a way in. Why aren't they taking the way in? They're supposed to be circumcised. So that's going to become a big debate in Acts 15. That's why that's a debate, is because we're not using the plan that we had for the last 1,000 years, right, of how we do this. And that really shows you kind of the uphill battle that Paul's in, is that is the way you do it. And so to come up with another way is controversial, to say the least, right? But again, I would argue the game changer is the Spirit, right? That seems to be the thing that shifts for these apostles. But yeah, they're proselytes. We get this really interesting line, visitors from Rome. We talked about this last time. This may be our only clue of how the church in Rome got started. We don't have a foundational story in the book of Acts that tells us like Paul was in the Agora, right? So this might be people like Andronicus and Junia, mentioned in Romans 16. They're called apostles, right? So they may have been back at the scene where they're Jewish. Junia is a Jewish name. And so they may have been at Pentecost. And again, the term visitors or residing, this is the debate. These people have come for Passover. They've stayed for Pentecost 50 days later, and then they're going to go back home. And so this is the first movement of the Jesus story outward from Jerusalem. So we have all these unnamed figures, right, in the story that we're going to meet later on. Luke is giving us a little preview of coming attractions, right? The nations are kind of at Jerusalem. But again, the big point I want us to see is that there's this little widening of the circle. And we're going to see this as a problem in Acts 5, right? There's these Greek-speaking Hellenist Jews and Hebrew-speaking Jews, and the Greek widows are getting overlooked in the story. Remember that story when they picked new disciples? That's the difference. They're all Jewish, but they speak a different language, and so there's already like a cultural divide between them. And so I think what you see through this book of Acts is this incremental movement outward. And that's one of the reasons why Luke is tracing this story, is how do we get the Theophilus from Acts 2? And that's what we're going to be unpacking over the next couple weeks. We only have a couple minutes left. My goal is to get into Acts 2, so. What we see here again is a great speech. Peter's taking as his text, this text from Joel, right? And again, these texts are forward-looking. And so as you look at this text, he takes the text of Joel and says that the thing that Joel prophesied about is happening now. The Spirit falls, and it causes Peter to think about the prophecy of Joel. And he says, this is what's happening. I will pour out my Spirit upon all flesh. You can underline that word all. This has become interesting for the latter part of the book. So all flesh, not just Jewish flesh, right? All human bodies are going to experience, or will have the capability of experiencing the Spirit. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. The your daughters part, I think, is new here. It's in the Joel text, but throughout that period, we get a lot of male prophets. Your Isaiahs, your Jeremiahs, your Malachi's, your Hoseas. You do get Isaiah's daughters, kind of a smaller note. But what we're going to see in this book, right, we're going to see Phoebe's and Junia's and Chloe's and Lydia's and Dorcas, and you're going to see a lot of women in the story, right, especially going forward. In fact, there's almost women in almost every chapter of the book of Acts, if you know where to look. So I think Luke is saying, your daughter shall prophesy, right? And so this is that kind of big turning point in the story where the Spirit falls. These last days are upon us, Peter says. And so we're in that era where the Spirit is being given. And this is kind of that big hinge point which changes the way the apostles read Scripture. It messes with the timeline. It happens in the middle of time, as N.T. Wright says, right? And it causes a revolution of thinking. This is something that we thought was coming in the last days, but the last days have broken into now. And now we're in this, to quote G. Ladd, already not yet, right? We have some parts of the end, but not all of it, right? So we have a Messiah who's been resurrected, and we have a Spirit that's been given. Those are definitely signs of the kingdom coming. That when will you restore the kingdom? Remember that first question, Acts 1:6? This is part of that, because the Spirit is part of that age. And so we get this kind of partial fulfillment. All right, we have probably time for one or two questions. We'll come back next week and look at the community that's formed out of this, and then look at some of the problems and pitfalls in Acts 4 and 6 there. Yeah?
I'm just being controversial.
Yes, great.
Why are there churches who think women can't be priests?
Well, looks like we're out of time. Say that for next week. I need a bell. Say that bell. I mean, that's, I mean, there are texts, and I think, as I was just at the church on Saturday talking about this, they're about to have women elders for the first time. I would argue, and this is a very broad brush, so don't throw rocks at me, I think a lot of our traditions are devoid of the Spirit. So I think, like, the argument for women's inclusion, I think we have lots of texts, but I think it's the Spirit. And I think the more our traditions have downplayed the role of the Spirit, and our charismatic friends and brothers and sisters have reminded us of this, I think the more this makes sense. Because if the Spirit gives gifts, right, of preaching and teaching and apostleship, right, the gifts aren't gendered. I think it's that missing Spirit piece. I think it's let's put it in the best way I can frame it, an unintended consequence of downplaying the Spirit is that you're also going to downplay who the Spirit gifts. When we focus on roles and offices and strip that from the Spirit, well, then we can kind of go this kind of gendered way. But I think this for me is the epicenter. I mean, this is where I want to start with people, not with 1 Timothy 2. We can get there, but you got to reckon with this first. How does the Spirit give people, and then let's start working that out. And that's where I think this is a better. So I think the Spirit piece is why, at the end of the day, you might have that struggle. There's obviously other texts that people are going to point to, but that I think is the missing piece. All right, we'll see you next week, Acts 4 and 5.